Hi there, everybody, and either good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this webinar on M365 autoclassification. And I am John Mancini, and I'm associated with Infotection, and I'll be acting as our Master of Ceremonies today. We're really fortunate to have two incredibly knowledgeable folks, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves in just a second. For my part, my background is that I was CEO of AIM for 20 plus years, and I do a lot of consulting in the records and content space, including working with the good folks at Infotection. So Brian, why don't you quickly introduce yourself, and then Frederick, and then we'll get started.
Sure. My name is Brian. I'm a partner at Infotection. I've been consulting in large volumes of unstructured and ungoverned content for about 30 years now, and a large part of my focus is on dealing with all the ways to classify content, and particularly in the M365 environment.
And I'm Frederick Lapierre. I'm a Microsoft consultant, and I'm based in the Netherlands, in Europe. And I've been with Microsoft for 20 years and different technology, but a lot in information architecture, document management, and compliance, and I'll be talking about the nice things that we can do on the platform.
Terrific. So just a couple of administrative items before we get started. There is a handouts tab, and we put some specifically designed handouts for this webinar there. I'll be reminding you of that as we get into the content here, so make sure that you check on those and download those. Secondly is that there is a questions tab, and we will be gathering those questions during the course of the presentations by Brian and by Frederick, and get to as many of them as possible during the course of the hour. If we don't get to your question during the course of the hour, we will follow up directly and answer some of the questions thereafter. So with that, why don't we get going? And Brian, if you could just click to the next slide.
I hope I can. Hang on a second. Are you able to see that?
It's still the
It's still there. It looks like one of those slides that has that pesky animation on it. That there we go. Okay, awesome. So I just thought quickly, I've been doing some work for AIM in the course of the last couple of years on working on some of their industry research programs. And so what I thought I would do is just start with a couple of data points from their most recent reports that I wrote that focus on, at least for me, some signs that you might have a classification problem. So first one, why don't you click to the next slide, Brian? So the way to look at these next three slides is look at the area in dark gray on the left-hand side of the slide, because the questions that I asked of folks was to try to figure out whether they had processes in place relative to each of the three things that I'll talk about, and then also get a sense of how automated those processes are. Because I think as people look at the rising tide of both volume and variety of information that's flowing into their organizations, I think there's a growing realization that you can't handle that growing volume and variety with the traditional ways that you've always handled it, and that you really have to figure out how to automate that, which brings us into the whole topic of today. But I thought it might be useful to start with a couple of these data points just to illustrate that organizations are at a fairly early stage right now in terms of trying to sort through the question of how they manage their content. So this first one was disposition of redundant, obsolete, and trivial content is an accepted and regular organizational discipline. So in other words, you've kind of moved beyond ad hoc approaches, and you have a disciplined approach to it. So what you can see here is that 63% of the folks basically have an awful lot of manual processes associated with that. And again, that's a recipe for problem moving forward. Next slide. Second, it gets into this question of the policies and processes. This isn't even really a case of automation of the process, but you can't really have an automated auto-classification approach to managing content if you don't have policies and processes in place in order to protect personally identifiable information. And so again, in this survey that I did, you can see let's see, 58% basically come back and have pretty ad hoc approaches. Next slide. And then metadata obviously becomes critically important if you're going to try to manage things in an automated fashion. And again, as you look at this data, organizations clearly report that they're at the early stages of this. These are indicators, if you have this kind of phenomenon within your organization, that autoclass is something that you ought to be talking about, that you ought to be investigating seriously, that you should be trying to push as hard as you possibly can. Because if you rely on manual processes to address an information rise that is uncharacteristic of anything that we've had in the past, you're sowing the seeds for basically constantly being behind the curve. Next slide. And then just the last thing that I wanted to raise is I asked this question about barriers that organizations experience in their organization when it comes to automating information governance, and certainly autoclass is a key element in automating information governance. And so I just thought I'd raise this as maybe just a little bit of context and background to think about as Brian and Frederick go through the presentation, of thinking about some things that you need to keep in mind as you go through these kinds of projects. Next slide. So this question, which of the following is the most important barrier towards moving forward aggressively with governance projects? And the reason I chose this slide, and this is, I think, something to keep in mind in any project, but particularly when it comes to projects associated with automating governance, is that if you look at those bars in dark gray, we lack clear strategy and priorities. Change management worries. It's been difficult to establish a clear ROI. Those are not technical issues. And so I think at the heart of this slide, and one of the things that I just want to leave you with before passing over to Brian, is that, you know, one of the things that I've been most impressed with in working with the InfoTection folks is this question of marrying business strategy with information strategy, and that far too often people hop into these kinds of projects with a pure focus on the technology itself without really thinking about how the business strategy needs to align with that strategy. And so keep these things in mind, that the technology is a challenge moving forward, given how rapidly it's changing, but the real challenge is garnering the organizational commitment and focus and clarity of vision in order to drive these kinds of projects forward. So let me turn over to my good friend, Brian Tumla. I've known Brian for a million years, and maybe not quite a million, but Brian is going to take it from here, and so take it away, Brian.
Thank you, and I have to say I'm really impressed with your ad hoc mathematical skills and abilities in that first slide there. So adding all those numbers up, just like that. A real quick start on this, just so you can get a concept of how all this stuff is going to fit together. At InfoTection, we have a vision for information and information governance that really starts on the right-hand side with governance and compliance. The idea is if you're going to start classifying things, it's really helpful to know what your goals are, what your strategy is, how do you build those things all together, and then moving backwards. And the real value for that is at the organization. Moving back in the other direction on the far left is it's really the simple, straightforward ad hoc stuff, the search-based stuff, the amalgamation of information so that when you need something, it's there for you. Tends not to be focused on particular processes. But the real value for the classification, what we're going to talk about on the AI stuff and the machine learning stuff in the middle, is how does that auto classification fit both what you've already organized and classified, and how do you get that into the level of understanding what your overall governance and compliance and strategies are. To get through this, at the beginning, we're going to start a little bit with some of the myths that are out there, just so you know why we're doing these things and how we tie them all together, because people have a tendency, like John said, to focus on a technology or just technology without looking at the overall process. So we kind of wanted to tie all of those things together. The first is really just looking at the purpose of auto-classification. There's 4 levels to it. Very often auto-classification is used just to try and get to figure out what something is, to classify it into a bucket, to know what it is. On the very far left, like I said, is the one-time search. How can you make search easier within your environment? Because a search is something where in the middle of a manual process or some activity, you realize you need to go through and do an investigation or any discovery or gather some information governance insights in there. So you need to search, and so building up things that are generically very useful for search is part of what we want to do in this. More likely, if you're putting in an M365 environment, you're interested in classifying things. The second one is really a classifier into content types. So we call it type identification. The point and purpose would be to say, this looks like an invoice, this looks like a contract, this looks like a specification, and understand what that piece of whatever it is that you're looking at. We're dealing with massive volumes of information, so being able to do that is a very handy thing. What that ties to then is, once you have a type, you can then start classifying things into a context or a value. So that could be a retention schedule. It could also be, what is the valuable stuff that we have? What is the high risk stuff? What is the sensitive stuff? So it's larger buckets of information where types and metadata fit into that. So understanding that you're not just trying to identify types, but how does the type fit into what is valuable within your organization? And then the last thing, which I think is missed in a lot of cases, is the idea that you can use auto-classification to extract metadata. And the metadata is valuable for protection, reporting, integration, any number of things. We're going to talk about all of these things. Know that some of these technologies that we're going to talk about are particularly good at type. Some are particularly good at metadata. Sometimes combinations of all of those together is really what we want to move towards. Question is why? Why do we auto-classify? Well, obviously the biggest reason is that there's a whole lot of content out there. If you had to manually classify the content in an M365 environment, you have a few challenges that you're going to face. The first is that staff generally don't remember what they have in this collection of whatever it is. Particularly, and we're going to talk about this, if you're migrating from a shared drive into an M365 environment, you're talking about content that they worked with maybe 10 years ago. They don't generally remember what they have. They don't really know what a record is. We know that from experience. And so having their consistency in the way they classify things is a difficult thing. The third thing is that the people who have been around your organization the longest are generally the most expensive resources in your organization. They don't have time to do that classification. And so you've got to rely on interns and lesser people to try and do that manual classification, just because the more expensive people aren't available to do that kind of work. And then sometimes we do the classification really because it's the only way to achieve compliance. So if you're going to do this, you need to consider the value of auto classification. On the right, you can see a very, very short, brief, summarized time motion study done by a very large organization about 10 years ago. As you can see, there's not a lot of nuance to it. The idea is if I'm going to be putting stuff into a content repository, I'm going to take about 30 seconds to figure out whatever that piece of content is. And then I'm going to take about 30 seconds to do the metadata tagging of figuring out what project it is, what retention it is, whatever else it happens to be. In this organization, they realized that each person had on average about 1.5 gigabytes of content, which works out to about 1,500 files per person. And they therefore calculated that was about 3 days for every person in the organization. At an organization like Microsoft, just to pull one out of the air, because I can find these stats on the internet pretty easily, with 166,000 staff at an average of $500 per day, that's $250 million worth of time and motion that you have to spend to do that classification. So like I said, real basic, real simple, not a lot of nuance to it, but the value is obviously there. There's some, if you had to do it in order to be compliant for whatever your reasons are, there's some good ways to automate that, and we'll try and focus on those kinds of things. It's also true that we classify things. There is actually an ISO standard developed around why we classify. There's more information there if you want to look up that ISO standard. Primarily, what we want to do with metadata and classifying content is link things together so that we have records related to a particular category together. If they're part of a project, they're linked together. Consistent naming of records over time, and you'll find consistency of naming is really a big value of what auto classification is, both at the site level and the template level and the metadata level and the labeling level. So consistency, classification assists in retrieving records related to particular function, topic, or activity, and we'll talk about that. It also helps you find content when it's not where it's expected, because if the metadata is there, you can follow the logic that says, well, if it's not in the right folder, what else might be containing that kind of metadata within those folders? So you can find things that are misfiled really a whole lot easier if you can do that. Integrating systems together. This is really useful if you're talking about event triggers and you need to integrate your content with an invoice, for example, with a purchasing system, or an HR record with an HR system, to build that logic and build systems to work with each other. And then finally, really the user permissions on security and figuring out if you're trying to establish security within an organization, understanding what type of content needs to align with what people have access to that content is a very useful way to move forward with that. That's a lot of what the protection sensitivity labels in M365 is all about. When we build a classification, it's not just about the content. This is an important message in here. There are some tools out there that will allow you to do classification based on the actual words within the format of a piece of content. So on the invoice on the right here, all the words that you see would be the content. The content classifications give you words, number, patterns, phrases, topics, lists, similarity, a lot of things that you can rely on to do some good classification. A piece of content also has a format, and the format should be used for a number of things, including finding out the status of things. If it's a rendition, like a PDF rather than a Word document, does that mean that it's a final, in which case you've got a life cycle status to apply. So looking at the format of what a piece of content is really gives you a lot of information that you can then start working together. And we'll give you examples of how all these can work together. The third is the metadata, which is the context. So names, acronyms, authorship or responsibility, transmissions, where it's been moved, age and relevance and lifecycle status. All of those things might be part of what folder it was put in, what the file attributes are of the file, all the stuff that's around the file. And we'll talk about how we can leverage some of that. And then finally, workflow, which is a status of content that's in motion. The big takeaway is that your content, really more than anything, helps you identify your topic, similarity, and sentiment. Your context, which is the attributes, indicates your function, status, and ownership. So you can see how all those things really work together to put stuff into valuable, less valuable, records retention categories, all the stuff that we're going to be classifying content into. Real quickly on the data in motion, and then we'll get into what the tools actually are. Data in motion basically is content that has not settled yet. So it's being edited, it's in the process of flowing around through approvals. It's doing a number of things where there is real valuable content and metadata and classification capabilities that you can extract out of that content because of the fact that it's in motion. And that's one of the real values that you find in M365 as opposed to something like a pure classification indexing type tool, is you're in control of the process by which content is created. And therefore, along that way, while you're doing that, think about the fact that your workflow might be a good way to add metadata to the files, rather than looking at it after the fact. Once it's data at rest and it's been put into the right folder, it's been classified by being put into that folder. But you think back about the data in motion, you control that process. So that's an important function in the classification world that we're looking at. Now, the rest of the stuff that we're going to be talking about really is just about how to classify the content that you're putting on a day-to-day basis into M365, or if you're going to be migrating large volumes of content from a previous ECM system, whatever it happens to be, into M365, what can you leverage to make that helpful and more beneficial for where you're moving forward? So I'm going to hand it over to Frederick.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So thanks for the introduction, and I think we can't stress enough again what John and Brian said, that there is more than the technology around the classification. The context, the use cases, why do you do that is as important, if not more important, than the technology. For my part, I will focus on the technology and what the platform offers you to be able to classify your content. And I'll be talking about two things. I'll be talking about what the M365 platform offers you, but I also make the link to other technology on Microsoft, like the Azure Cognitive Services, and how you can leverage that to extend the the classification possibility on your content. So the first part will focus on Microsoft 365. So you have your content in your environment. It could be SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, emails, etc. And we have, it's not such a defined entity. I call that classification services. That's a global name for different technology, different part on the platform that allows you to classify your content. We will look one by one of those different classifier methodology to classify the content, and we will also look at how they can interact together to build even more a powerful application and services based on those classifications. So Brian, if we could move to the next slide. So the first classifier that we have on the platform is called the sensitive information type. And the sensitive information type, there are two types of sensitive information type on the platform. They rely on the same technology, but we have a set of built-in information type. And I give here a couple of samples, like a credit card, a social security number, an IBAN number, etc. Those are mechanisms to recognize those concepts, and they are based on different technology. It could be dictionary, keyword, regular expression. There could be some validation function to verify that that IBAN number that has been recognized is a real IBAN number and not just like a series that match a particular regular expression. So those sensitive information type will work on the content itself. So if you have a SharePoint document, it will crack the document open when the document is indexed and see if one of those sensitive information type is present in the document, and it could be one or two. It could be that you have a credit card and a social security number in the same document, and it will classify the document, saying that document contains a credit card or that document contains a social security number. So you have the built-in type, and there is, I don't know on top of my head, but there is quite a lot of sensitive information type. I might use the acronym SIT sometime. I'll try not to, but if I say SIT, I mean sensitive information type. You can also define your own custom information type by using the different type of mechanism to recognize the content. A regular expression. So, for example, you wanna recognize license key for software. You could develop a regular expression. You could use dictionary, where you have an old dictionary of medical terms, for example, although the platform offers you one out of the box. But if you want your own, you could. Fingerprinting is giving the system a template, and then the system will be able to recognize a document that have been filled in, for example, a tax return or I don't know, a mortgage request document, and that you can use a single element, a regular expression, or you could also use supporting element that will increase the confidence that the concept that you're looking for in the document is what it is. Because, for example, if you look at a credit card, if you only match on a 16-digit regular expression, you might match a lot of false positive. So by adding supporting elements, you can increase the confidence of recognizing a real credit card number and not only a 16-digit number. And then we have what we call exact data match. And exact data match is something that you can link with an external system. It could be a database. The synchronization mechanism is through a CSV file, where you can not only recognize, for example, a credit card, but a real number of a credit card. For example, I will have a match on a Brian's or John's credit card because I have an exact data match. So it's not only recognizing the format, but a real data match. And you can use that for addresses, names, and those kind of things. So that's the first type. Could you please move to the next slide? The other classifier or classification mechanism that we have on the platform is trainable classifiers. So trainable classifiers are machine learning and artificial intelligence concept that will be able to recognize type of document. For example, recognizing a resume or a CV, or recognizing a C# source code, or recognizing a in the oil and gas a well report or an agreement. And that and just like the sensitive information tab, we have a bunch of built-in classifier on the platform that are provided with the system. And there are things like profanity, resume, source code, threat, and targeted harassment, a typo here, that will then recognize those concepts wherever they are. You can also build your own trainable classifiers, and you do that by training the system by giving seeds, so documents that represent your concept. So you would, for example, give them a lot of agreements, then you test the system, then you validate the system, and you publish the model, and then it will be able to recognize whatever the concept it is that you've been training the system with. So and it's fairly new. This is but it's one of the really powerful mechanism to address what Brian and John were mentioning at the beginning, is that, you know, it takes a long time to do that, and if you can automate that process, it will have a very positive effect on a lot of different things. Can we move on, please? Yeah, the next one is sensitivity label, and you probably noticed that the color of the sensitivity label box is slightly different than the other one. And the reason is that a sensitivity label is a mechanism to classify content, but it's also directly, it has more meaning than just a label. It is a sensitivity label, and there is a level of protection that is associated with that label. So you don't only classify the content, but you also protect the content at the same time by using sensitivity label. So you can do things like encryption, making sure that that document, when the label is applied, is encrypted and can't be read by everyone. You could do content marking, visual marking, such as watermark, footers, and headers. Sensitivity label can be applied for document, but they can also be applied for group and site on the platform. So you could have a classify a all SharePoint site or a Teams with a sensitivity label, and you can drive other type of protection than you do on the document. So for example, there isn't encryption, but you can define a conditional access based on the sensitivity label that you apply at container level. And you can apply a sensitivity label manually by just choosing it. A suggestion from the system saying, hey, I think that you should classify that document as highly confidential because it contains certain type of sensitive information. Or you can automatically, and automatically we'll talk about it later, but you can also automatically apply the label on those documents. Could we move on, please? The next type of way to classify your content is retention label. And just like sensitivity label, retention label is not only a classification label, but there is also some policy, and this time it's not protecting the document, but it's managing the life cycle of the document, retaining the document, deleting the document, disposing the document, and how it is triggered based on which based on the date of the creation date, the modification date, when the label has been applied. There is different way of managing the lifecycle of the document, but it's classifying and in that case managing the lifecycle. And just a bit like the sensitivity label, you can apply them manually. You can have default. So think about what Brian was saying with your workflow. When you move that document in a certain place, it will automatically be labeled with a particular label because of the location, because of the workflow. And we also have automatically labeling, and I'll come back on that later. Could we move on, please? So the next one, which is also fairly recent, and it's only for SharePoint, is something, a classifier based on syntax. So syntax is also an AI mechanism. However, it's different than trainable classifier in the sense that it's not machine learning, but it's machine teaching. So it's not that the system will learn how to recognize an agreement, for example, or a contract, but the machine will recognize agreement or contract because you give them clue how to recognize a contract. So you provide explanation to the system, hence the machine teaching. You teach the system how to recognize a concept. And you have two things in syntax. You have the classifier itself, so it will recognize, for example, a contract, but then you can also define extractors. Within that contract, you will be able to extract the concept. So for example, you would have which legal entity, for example, signs a particular contract. You would have the counterparties that sign the contract. You will have maybe extracting the expiry date of the contract, the signature date, and other type of concept through the extractor. So the classifier, so recognizing the type of document, will be translated into a content type, and the extractor itself, so the extracting a concept within that type of document, will be a side column with a piece of metadata. So it's really enriching the content type and the metadata that I'm going to talk next with automatically extracting those information. What is important to remember with syntax is that it's a new technology, and currently it works very well if the document is well structured, because you need to provide explanation, and it's easier to provide good explanation if your document is well structured than having trying to find a common denominator to extract an expiry date in a contract if there is absolutely no similarity between 2 or 3 of 10 contracts that you use to teach the system. Next slide, please. The last one is content type and metadata, which is a generalization of the previous one. And in SharePoint, and it's mainly true for SharePoint, you can define your content type and your metadata, and you can have all type of classification based on those content type metadata by using taxonomy or taxonomy from the system. And again, here it is typically it's something that you do manually, but it's better if you can, as Brian mentioned, drive those content type, drive those metadata through workflows. For example, having an HR system storing your HR document in a particular location and immediately populating the employee number that the document is for. Next slide, please. So now we're going to see how all those things interact together and how we can do some automation based on that. So the first step of automation that we can do is applying auto labeling, sensitivity label, sorry. And here in green, I have the concept that you can use in order to automatically apply a sensitivity label. So in green is the concept, and in red, how to automatically apply a sensitivity label in that case. So we have two ways of automatically applying labels, sensitivity label. The first one is client side, and what I mean with client side is that typically you apply a sensitivity label when you create a document in Word, for example, or a sensitivity label when you send an email in Outlook desktop or Outlook on the web. So client side is when the document is open, and when the document is open, you can again manually apply that. But from an automation point of view, you can use either the sensitive information or the trainable classifier that has been recognized as content of the document, and you can make either a suggestion offering, the system will offer to the user a suggestion saying, hey, maybe you should again classify that as confidential or highly confidential, because I recognize that there was a SIT, a credit card number in that document, or that my trainable classifier was a contract. So you have the suggestion, or you can automatically force that label depending on the configuration that you choose. So that's the client-side version. The server-side version, again, the client-side version is what Brian described as content in motion or content in transit. So when that content is in transit and opening, it could be done. The server side is targeting content at rest. So once the content is already on the site, is not, you don't interact with the site, you can auto apply a sensitivity label based not on trainable classifier here, but only on SITs. So for all document that has a particular SIT, it will be classified as public, for example. There is a number of limits for the server-side mechanism with a maximum number, current maximum number of 25,000 label file per day. You can't apply those policy on too many sites at once. It's 10 policy for 10 sites. So those are the mechanism of auto-classifying, automatically applying sensitivity label based on either sensitive information or trainable classifier. Could we move to the next one? The same apply, almost the same apply for a retention label, except that for retention label, we don't have a client-side way of suggesting a retention label. It's only a server-side mechanism that will based on SIT or trainable classifier or on a Kql query. Kql stands for query language. So that's the query language for the search in SharePoint. So you can, based on the SIT, so if something contain a particular credit card number, a particular SIT, or is recognized through a trainable classifiers as a contract, or using the Kql, so using the content itself of the document, or using the property, and for example, using the metadata. For example, we've implemented for an oil and gas customer a solution where we use all those rich metadata that is on the document to automatically apply the right retention for the right type of document. When you use Kql and metadata, you need to be aware of the fact that only standard managed properties can be used. You can't define your custom managed property and use that in a Kql query. So if you have specific metadata that you want to use, you can map them with predefined managed properties such as refinable string or refinable date. Could we move on, please? And the other thing is what I explained with syntax is that syntax will automatically extract, will automatically classify document and extract concept and will translate them in content type and metadata. So if you really want a complex scenario, you could use syntax to extract metadata and use that metadata in a KQL query to automatically apply a retention label, for example. Next slide, please. So now we're going to leave M365 to enter the Azure concept, the Azure context, sorry, and quickly talk about cognitive services. Cognitive services is a set of tools that are built on Azure that based on artificial intelligence, and that allows you to extract some or to perform some recognition on the content. And there are a set of big blocks of functionality that we have. We can do some vision. So for example, recognizing concept in images. There are things that we can do in search to retrieve content and do complicated search on those concepts. There is why search twice? One of them should be speech, so we can do speech recognition. We can make decision based on rules, and there is the search part. The last one, which is very interesting, is the language. And in the language, there is a thing called text analytics, and text analytics allows you to do a lot of things in the language space, like detecting the language of a document. Is it a Norwegian or an English or a German document? We can do entity extraction, like key phrases, name entity, PII, and I'll show you a sample later on. We can do sentiment analysis. Is it something positive or negative that is described in that document? And we start to see a specific branch application there, where we start to see a medical terminology, where we can then recognize things like drug prescriptions and all those medical terms. So if you can go to the next slide, Brian, please. So here, for example, it's a very simple sample where you have a piece of text here that has been given to the text analytics, sorry, and you see the different concepts that are popping up. So the language is recognized that it's English, and it's 100% confidence that it's English. The key phrases, you can read them, but there is things like online menu, steakhouse, kitchen. So those are the key phrases that has been extracted from the text. In the middle, you see the sentiment, and in green is positive, and in red is negative. So the first thing is the sentiment, and it's a restaurant review. So the overall sentiment for that is positive. I think it's 80%. I can't really see, it's too small for here, but because almost everything is positive. There is only, then the first sentence is 100% positive. There is only the last sentence, which isn't really positive, because it says that the food didn't come fast enough. But the overall, so you have overall sentiment and sentiment phrase by phrase. Then it can extract named entities also, like Contoso, the Steakhouse, New York, etc. And the PII entities is also able to recognize a person or a URL or a phone number. So all those things can be used with, can be retrieved and extracted with text analytics, which brings us then to the next slide, Brian. So where you can do so much more advanced things in cognitive services that you could do with only the trainable classifier or the syntax classifier. Think about vision, for example, and using those content that are extracted from Azure and populating them back into your content tab on your metadata in SharePoint, and then hooking data back into the retention, for example, or any other workflow that is based on that metadata that you are doing. So the last part I want to talk about is once you have all those classification, what can you do from a policy point of view? So Brian, if you could move on to the next slide. So now that you have all those classification, so you know that you have documents that contain sensitive information or personal identifiable information, or that you have contracts and that you have HR, a review document, etc. What do you do with that? We talk already a bit with sensitivity label and retention label, because those are not only classifiers, but they also indicate a certain level of protection of etc. But then you can also look at data loss prevention, where you could use those trainable classifiers, those labels, also the labels themselves, to stop information being shared outside. You can use information governance to manage the lifecycle disposition of your document, information protection to manage the encryption, communication compliance to monitor the communication between your employees and making sure that they don't use bullying languages or harassment languages. You can monitor the behavior of your employees with information risk management that all leverage all those classifications to understand that, for example, a user is trying to send a lot of source code via email after he has been fired. So those type of things, all those policy leverage really the classification that you've done on the platform. And with that, I give it back to you, Brian.
So I don't know if any of you have kids and if you've ever seen any of the YouTube videos about unboxing something. So somebody will get a new iPhone and they'll unbox it and figure out and poke at it and discover all the things. This presentation to me is a lot like that, because a lot of these technologies are quite new to the M365 world. They're not necessarily new to the world of large volume indexing, classification, structures, and developments, but it's really nice to see these in an environment where it's all sort of integrated and doing things at a much broader level because of the fact that you're in this platform. So what we know from having worked with some of these tools that have been around for a while, each one of those functions and capabilities is not new, and it's not rocket science in and of itself. It's really the amalgamation of all of them together that's adding value. So having worked with these types of tools in the past and other large organizations, we're going to give you some strategies for success. If I can fit it into the time remaining, I think we shouldn't have too much of a problem with that. One of the big messages, and you'll get from the pictures particularly, is that your content isn't always as clear and unambiguous as you'd like. Sometimes things look like one thing, but they can act like another. So your content will always be a little ambiguous, and we want to work around some of these things. First of all, here's a high-level scope for the way you want to deal with this stuff. The first thing to do when you're going to be doing an auto-classification project, and it may be an ongoing program that we want to establish within your organization, but the idea of figuring out what your data map is, look at your sources, know what content is where, and if you can focus your energies when you're doing either a migration or a classification on similar content, that helps a lot with a lot of these steps. So the value of a good map is things like which of your 5,000 shares or 60,000 on-premise SharePoint sites have particular types of data. And if you can focus your auto classification on just those specific ones, you'll get better results and better quality at the end of it. The extraction part is really valuable because the extraction is the bit that says, maybe it's an image, but within that image, I can OCR it and extract out an invoice number, which helps me do a lot of classification bits and pieces. I think this is one of those areas that's going to grow because there's a lot of potential for how do you want to change a piece of content from when you first see it to what you actually need to classify it with. And for example, we're doing work with oil and gas companies to look for things like geospatial data to extract that out and be able to map it in an environment. So all the interesting innovations that come out of the indexing extraction part. understanding your classification features and functions, put things into where they're supposed to be, and then finally acting upon it. So don't just classify, but figure out what your end goal is and how do you act upon the content so that in the future you don't have to recreate all of these things that we're going to go through. So this is basically it's a more complex diagram than it needs to be for this presentation, but I'll walk through it real briefly. This is a way to deal with things like file shares. So in the past, what you probably found is organizations doing an analysis and extraction of all the data that's building an index of all the stuff that's on a shared drive, and then figuring out what that information is, organizing it, putting it into the right buckets, and then moving it into a SharePoint site. This is basically saying you can take all that content and move it directly into an Azure file share without any preconceived filtering above and beyond what you need to, and use all of the Azure pipeline capabilities that you just learned about, and then following that, the decision categories that you learned about to say things like, well, this looks like garbage. This looks like it's maybe valuable, but shouldn't be on a shared drive. This is stuff that needs to be retained. This is stuff that's collaborated on. Put it all into the right buckets, and then expose that back to the users. It's a way of transitioning off the shared drive environment. There's some challenges with that. First is not all your content really needs to be moved in order to classify it, but you can do it that way. This is typically what you might find on an average file share. This is an amalgamation of about 4 very large organizations looking at their common shared drive content. You'll see that there is some stuff on the top right that's worthy of migration and collaboration. Only a small portion is really collaborative content. The static stuff is stuff that has never been touched or moved or seen since it was first created, but there's still some value in capturing that. At the bottom, you find things like structured databases, system applications, multimedia, things that may or may not want to exist in the cloud in your new environment. Possibly you can decide, but there may be more optimal ways to store that. Stuff on the left, the remove content is the garbage files, it's the rot. Talk a little bit about that in a second. It's definitely not stuff that you typically find if you're moving and trying to classify stuff that's already in an M365 environment. And then there's some stuff that just needs to be converted because it's going to lose its links and lose various other things. So the challenges really are, if you're going to move everything all at once, you still want to be able to review and understand your false positives before you commit to labels. And you needed a way to work around that. There's a little bit of a time delay in getting stuff into Azure and therefore classified. So you want to make sure that you've got a way to capture any changes that have happened to your original content before that. You're duplicating storage for a period of time. You're possibly breaking links and breaking content. For the most part, this approach saves you the process of needing to buy an external e-discovery tool or investigations tool to get to the point where you at least understand what your content is and know how to move forward with it on shared drives. With training classifiers, this is an interesting one. So this is the process is when we were talking about the training classifiers and finding similar content is you want to identify what it is that you're looking for. So you're looking for exemplars. You add into the exemplar classifier something that says these are responsive and these aren't responsive, and it'll start looking for content that matches those criteria. You get the results, you review it, you decide what it captured that maybe it shouldn't have or didn't capture that it should have, and then you iterate that again. When you're done, then you do that extraction. So there's some real challenges to this. In some cases, you're looking for function for a retention category or other type of classification, and a function is different than a topic. So if we're going to find things that are similar because they're both based on something like nuclear isotopes, that doesn't tell you whether it's an invoice from a company where you're processing nuclear isotopes versus a contract where nuclear isotopes are the main topic and function. So understand there's a difference between function and topic. The function can change over time. So even though it's the exact same piece of content, when you classify it once, it may now be something else. It's kind of a complex thing we don't need to get into right now, but just understand that your content function can change. You'll find things like similarity between spreadsheets. If it's a departmental budget versus an enterprise budget, they're different types of records, but they're very, very similar in nature, and it's going to be a hard thing to try and figure out or have the classifier figure out what makes one enterprise versus departmental. The process can be cumbersome because you have to do multiple clicks to get through and build a classifier. And in many cases, the actual context and format of the file isn't part of what's being analyzed. It's just looking at the text. Other than that, it's a wonderful way to sort of put things into buckets of similar functionality, and I think that's the topic and basis behind where the Viva topics is trying to come from too, is subject-based classifications. One of the tips to add into this whole process is, if you're going to be using especially classifiers, but any of these other classification techniques, is to try not to boil the ocean when you're doing a classification. So a typical SharePoint site has a maximum of, I believe it's 10 terabytes. Very often we run into organizations with 2-3 petabytes. And so obviously you can't do a single migration of all that content into a single location. So it's important to think about, let's make it specific and focused and targeted in terms of function, so that all the content that gets in there is one thing and not something else. Particularly with regular expressions, and I'm not sure if this is a better slide to talk about this, but when you're looking for things like credit card numbers, as we were talking about, the one thing that'll make a security officer cry faster than anything else is if you show them the 100,000 credit card numbers that are on their share drive or in their SharePoint sites, when in fact, being a little more specific and understanding the scope and scale of credit card numbers are not going to be handled in this location, but they are going to be handled in this location. So separating those out is a very valuable thing. And that gets us to understanding what false positives are. So like I said, if you're looking for something particular, trying to classify a certain thing, there's some ways that you can say, let's not make it too broad, let's not make it across the board everything, in which case you start getting into the ambiguous content and you're not really sure why something showed up somewhere. It's a very difficult thing to try and work through. So some ways to reduce false positives: only look in the locations where you know that that data is going to exist. So if you're trying to migrate content or classify content in an HR system, don't look in the IT department, don't look in the marketing department, don't look in the legal department. Start with where your content, where you know your content is. It's really tempting to say, let's just throw everything in the bucket and see what comes out. Don't do it that way. It's better to be more careful about that. Be a little judicial on types of classification criteria you're looking for. Don't try and classify to everything. That's true with the way you index files on an ECM system. It's true with a lot of things. Be judicial. It means make sure you cover your bases and get all the things that you need, but don't try and overshoot. The Regex validation is a very important one. So as Pierre mentioned, if you have Frederick mentioned earlier, if you had a credit card number, it's 16 digits. If you can say, well, if it's 16 digits and it's near the name credit card, or that it follows a loon validation or some other thing to make sure that it's not just a random 16-digit set of numbers, that's an important part. Risk counting calculations: how many pieces of content are there in the file? If there's 10,000 credit card numbers in that Excel spreadsheet, it's probably more risky than one that's not. Clarifying things with additional queries, multiple properties and attributes, bring in all the other things that are out there. We'll give you some examples in just a second, but also do visualizations, build charts and say, what did we find? What does it look like? How do we understand what does this information mean to me? It makes it easier to say, well, this is obviously not what we were looking for, so we can determine that that's a false positive and move that out of the way. And then also associate it with important things. So if you're doing, for example, classification on a subject access request, knowing that data subject's name in conjunction with the credit card number and addresses that you found is a very good way to eliminate all the false positives that might be out there on that. When you're talking about the Kql examples, here's some examples just sort of logically of the kinds of queries that you can do. So if it was based on if this document was based on a personnel action form template saved by a manager in the HR department in this past year, then we know that it's got a 7-year retention for that particular type of file. So what you're looking at is not just a keyword, which would be like a personnel action form or the title. You're adding that to somebody like who owned it, who saved it, who did something to it, where is it saved, what is it doing, when was it saved, how did it get there, and therefore make a conclusion about what it is. Same thing's true with if it contains a valid contract number near the words contract number and it's not in the IT department in their sample data folder, you can classify it as a contract and apply the contract number as metadata. So building these logical conclusions about this piece of metadata, this piece of content, these keywords, these dates, all in a relative context to build the classifications. I know one organization that built their retention schedule with about 38,000 individual query combinations like this to put all the content into the classification buckets that they needed to work with. So that's just an example of what you're trying to do. I mentioned it earlier, being a little bit judicial about the types of content. Oh, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go through, understand your various taxonomies. What are you classifying to and why? What's important to keep, what's not important to keep. Look at your regulations. If you're doing GDPR and CCPA combined, there's some ways that you can futz with those classification rules to make them applicable to both situations. I'm sorry about this one. I'm going to skip this one. You can read this one earlier, but there's a lot of ways that we can, different types of taxonomies that you can classify into, whether it's records, privacy, divestitures, that kind of thing. Even within the IGRM, you'll notice that the different constituents around the IGRM model have their own taxonomy metadata that they want to be auto-classifying to as well. Records management, the real big message here more than anything else is big buckets and avoid event-based triggers wherever possible because they're harder to automate. But you can build classifications and learning classifiers and KQLs to basically put all the content that you have into specific categories, both on a legacy content and on a point forward basis. With sensitive data, make sure that you're storing and managing your data with similar content. So it's all in the same place, but you're leveraging the multiple taxonomies that are there. Keep it together in your deployments. Make a site dedicated to where you're managing PII, and then you don't have to worry about the security around all the others. So it's a way of building the structures around your sites. Data minimization is the idea of getting rid of stuff that you don't need. You can see some examples here. The real value on this one is build your rules at the enterprise level where you can, and then move down the road. What you don't want to be doing really is having each individual look at all of their files for PII. You get a lot of resistance from an administrative perspective to do that. So build your rules at the highest level and build down from there. When you're classifying files versus emails, you'll notice that there are some things that you have in files that you don't have in emails, things like formats and folders, dates, comparisons, templates, forms, a lot of non-content, but you do gain some other things. So your structure and your approach, if you build a classification taxonomy for files, it's going to be different than if you're doing it for emails. Start with the easy wins and keep working until the effort exceeds the business value. So start big, move slow. Find the retention category that has a lot of content in it as your starting point. So something that has a 2-year retention, something has a lot of broad, open definitions for what goes into it. Those are really good ones to start with, and then keep moving down until you don't add value anymore. You may find that this is a very long, continuous program that you're building, not just a one-time project. Throw away things that can be thrown away before you spend the time classifying. And this is an important lesson learned, I think, in a lot of ways. But the idea is, if you're looking at, you have a very important piece of content, here's a duplicate of it. This is garbage because it's a duplicate. But if you just auto-classified it, the auto-classification may not know that that's something that's not valuable, even though it'll classify the two of those exactly the same. This one's garbage. So get rid of stuff first and then classify the important stuff, and you'll save a lot of time and energy classifying stuff that you don't need to. Test, make copies of things, try it again, review, see if you're getting the results that you need. Understand that the auto-classification techniques that you've seen are 100% accurate. It's your content that's ambiguous. If you're looking for a duck-billed platypus, is it an amphibian? Is it a mammal? Is it something else? Whatever you've done, preserve and reuse it wherever you can. So apply the knowledge back into the files. If you've gathered private, public, confidential, if you've gathered attorney-client privilege, make sure that information stays with that file and in the long term. And that's the real gold and value that you're going to find from having it in a consistent organization like M365. Guiding principles, people have organized their content, so leverage what they've already done to it. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good, and be consistent. And finally, InfoTection, we do a number of things, primarily starting off at the information governance strategy level, looking at vision, success factors, KPIs, roadmaps. Once you've got that built, you know what you're trying to classify for, we can do the second level, which is where all this stuff sits, as well as a few other things, that information governance architecture, and then a number of solutions to make it fit in within your specific organization. I apologize for going over time on that, and we don't have time for questions, but there you go. If you do have questions, please feel free to reach out. If you would all link to Frederick and myself right now on LinkedIn, we'll know how to keep in touch, and we can talk to you in the future. And unless there's any other comments, John, did you want to wrap anything up?
Yeah, so let's wrap up. So just thank you all for all of the questions. This was one of the more engaged audiences, I think, on any webinar that I've been on for a long time. We tried to answer as many of, I think we answered all of these in the context of just offline direct responses. If we didn't answer your question, then please send me a note at john.m@infotection.com. That's john.m@infotection.com, and we'll follow up with you. And we will be sending out recordings of the presentation. Don't forget before we leave to get the additional materials in the handout section. And thank you very much, Brian, Frederick. Brian, you have a 6-part series on the Infotection blog about auto classification. If people haven't seen that, I would urge you to take a look at that. And Frederick and Brian, just thank you so much. It was incredibly illuminating, as reflected in the number of questions that we got.